But first, we want to speak to the man currently leading the RCMP, Interim Commissioner Mike Duheme. Commissioner, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David.
This report details a cascading series of policing failures before, during, and after this attack. Do you, as Interim Commissioner, accept that the police force failed the victims and the community in Nova Scotia?
Thanks for the question there, David. And you know, we've, as I mentioned earlier, I have not gone through the entire report that was provided and the recommendations that come forth. But I do admit that through the Attorney General of Canada, we did provide recommendations, and also the National Police Federation has also provided recommendations. And we've been working at improving the way since the incident actually occurred, and we weren't waiting for the report to be tabled before moving actions. There has been progress that has been done on the emergency alert, there's been progress done on the equipment, there's been progress done on the critical incident command structure. So we have been moving along before this was actually tabled.
So if you knew what to fix, you must have had a good sense of what went wrong. So I guess I go back to my question, is that an acknowledgement that the RCMP failed the people of Nova Scotia in 2020?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the members who attended the scene did the best they could with the training equipment they have. And the expectation of the Canadians and Nova Scotians when it comes to law enforcement is they want to ensure the community is safe. And on that particular day that was dragged out from April 18th to April 29th, with the challenge we faced, we weren't able to meet that challenge of keeping the community safe.
The report states that the RCMP's failure to share accurate and timely information with the public, including information about the shooter's disguise and the fact that he was using a replica RCMP cruiser, deprived 3 victims of the opportunity to take better measures to protect themselves. Does this mean that more people could be alive today if the RCMP had communicated better with the public?
So Dave, I think if we improve the communication, I'd be speculating how many lives we could have shared, because I actually went to the scene yesterday and visited the different sites, the number of crime sites there was. I spoke to some of the members of first responder, and on that particular night, it was very dynamic and challenging, and the flow of information was also a challenge because there's so many things going off in different scenes near the cottage where the initiative started, that it was difficult for our members to really understand exactly what was going on. As there was explosions on the right side, there was a fire, and then there's gunshots being fired otherwhere.
Right, but the report states that by 10:30 p.m. on the night of April 18th, roughly 30 minutes after the incident began, that the RCMP had received information from numerous sources that the shooter was driving a replica RCMP cruiser, and that information wasn't communicated to the public until nearly 12 hours later at 10:17 a.m. the next day. And in that period, 2 women were shot and killed. I mean, how can you explain that to Canadians?
So I think we recognize initially that the Twitter was used to inform individuals, and at the time the public alert system that's used for other incidents such as emergencies for weather watches or other types of nature, it wasn't used. Alert emergency was not designed for public safety events, and as a result of what we learned throughout this tragic incident is now that the public alert system is being used actually throughout the country for public safety events.
No, I understand that, and I appreciate things have changed going forward, but I'm trying to get an assessment of the consequences of the choices and actions or lack of actions had here. I mean, Heather O'Brien, a mother of 8, a Victorian Order of Nurse employee, Kristen Beaton, who was pregnant with her 2nd child, they were all shot after it was known to the RCMP that the shooter had a replica RCMP cruiser. So did the failure to disclose that information, based on what the Commission has found, it was potentially life-saving information that deprived them of the opportunity to make different choices?
So David, on that point, I haven't gone through the full report yet in detail as some, but I'm committed to do so and bringing about any changes that are required.
Okay, I want to touch on this because this came up in your news conference earlier. How much of the report have you read? It was delivered to the RCMP, as I understand, at 9 a.m. yesterday. It was given to the media shortly after that. Have you read any of this?
So the executive summary was received in the morning, yesterday morning, and the full report, my understanding, was received around 11:30. At 11:30, I went to the scene where the incident happened to have a better understanding and appreciation of what both victims' families, and our employees went through. I was also sitting down with first responders who were at the scene at that day and meeting with provincial representatives to discuss some of the way forwards, how we envision the way forward with regards to the tragic incidents.
Okay, but the executive summary is about 300 pages, I'm told. You haven't had time to read that? After you had your meetings, you didn't read this report knowing what you would be facing today?
No, I didn't go through it.
Help me understand your thought process there, sir. Why wouldn't you do that? I mean, you had a news conference today. 22 people are dead, 3 people were hurt, a province and a community were traumatized. Why didn't you read this so you could have a better understanding for the answers you're going to be asked to provide today?
Again, David, I was on the road the majority of the day, and it doesn't minimize the incident that took place, but I was on the road getting a better understanding of what exactly transpired during the April 18th and 19th in 2020.
Okay, but we knew this date was coming, right? This was a scheduled event, and there's been a lot of time when you could have visited those areas and been able to look at this report. I mean, the media has known for quite some time that they would be getting it on embargo to allow us to plan for this. I just don't understand, sir, why as interim commissioner, knowing the families and knowing the country will be looking for answers, you didn't take that time to read the 300 pages to be able to give them more specific responses to very specific recommendations and findings.
No, you raise a valid point, David, but when you're saying about having more time, or I have more time to visit the sites and I should have spent more time reading the report, with my appointment that happened March 18th, and the week I had to prepare for this, and then showing up here in this Tuesday, get a better appreciation of what the employees and first responders and victims went through, I thought that was important.
Given the findings in the report, the failures that are outlined here in the days leading up to this rampage, to the days that cover the attacks and the days after, the criticism for the police force is pretty profound. I just wonder, what confidence do you think Canadians should have in the RCMP and its ability to respond to complex situations like this and keep people safe?
Well, David, as previously mentioned, I mentioned that this is an unprecedented event that's never been seen in Canadian history. So when you talk about trust and confidence, yes, we realize we have to rebuild this trust and confidence with Nova Scotians, but also with Canadians. And that starts at the top with me, and I've committed to go through the entire report and look through the recommendations, provide an action plan, post it on a website that's accessible to the general public, who can hold us accountable on the progress and the work that we're doing on the recommendations.
The report suggests that the RCMP may need to be restructured from top to bottom, that there needs to be a full review, that past recommendations to reform the police force have not been fully implemented. You may not be the right agency to do contract policing, which is what we're dealing with here in Nova Scotia, where the National Police Force is acting essentially as a local police force. Do you agree that the RCMP isn't functioning as it should, based on the findings and the recommendations we've seen here today?
Well, David, right now, as it stands, we have a little over 30,000 people across the country that work day in, day out at making sure the communities are safe. So if there is a study to look at what is the policing structure in different provinces, the RCMP is more than happy to participate with public safety and the provincial representative to have a discussion as to what that would look like.
But there are things in the report that the RCMP needs to adopt a policy of admitting its mistakes, accepting responsibility for them, and ensuring that mechanisms are in place for addressing their errors. That talks about how the way the RCMP is structured creates response and communication problems, makes it difficult to determine accountability within the police force. All of these seems like big systemic problems that make the National Police Force unable to respond properly to these things and be held accountable for their failures.
David, as I mentioned, I am committed that we make sure that we review all these recommendations, and it's all about bringing changes to the organization to make it better. Not only the RCMP, but the law enforcement community writ large in Canada. We all must learn from this. If we do not learn and action some of these recommendations, the tragedy, the sad tragedy, the sad tragic loss of life would have meant nothing if we don't bring about changes in how we do things.
Okay, so how do we measure that, sir? I appreciate your explanation that you haven't read even the executive summary at this point. When will you read it? And when you do read it, will you hold a press conference to give more specific answers to the specific findings? Because I think a lot of my colleagues there found today a little bit unsatisfying. I'm not sure how the residents and the family members felt, but will you commit to doing that?
I can commit to following up with the press conference once the recommendations are reviewed.
Have you got a sense of how quickly that might happen, sir? Like, is this within 30 days, within 60 days?
I don't have that, Dave, but I'd be more than happy to come back to you.
Okay, and just on a big picture point, I mean, there's been a lot of questions about whether the RCMP is the right agency to do this contract policing. I mean, do you feel, I mean, you're the interim commissioner now, but you've been in the force a long time. Is the RCMP the right organization to do this type of policing? Do we need to just look at the full mandate of what the RCMP is and does and maybe bring changes to its function and form?
Well, again, I always accept a review of the mandates. We've seen in other provinces where they have discussed the possibility of going with their own police force. Again, we have 30,000 dedicated employees that serve the Canadian public in ensuring that the communities are safe on a daily basis. We will continue to do that. And if there is reform required to the RCMP, we will participate in the exercise with public safety and provincial representatives and territorial as well.
So in your time there to go and look at the scene and familiarize yourself with the roads and the geography, did you meet with any of the family members of the victims of these shootings? Have you talked to them?
I did meet with some family members, yes.
And what assurances and what message did you give them in terms of how you will respond to this and what you will do on this?
David, I provide assurances to them individually. And some actually want to be part of the solution. So it was a very productive conversation with the members, with the surviving members.
Okay. Interim Commissioner Mike Duheme, thanks for your time.
Thank you, David. Have a good day.
Minister of Public Safety Marco Mendicino, who oversees the RCMP, was pressed earlier today on the Commissioner's admission that he had not yet read the report or even the executive summary. He was asked bluntly, is that acceptable?
You heard Commissioner Duheme accept on behalf of the RCMP their responsibility for the significant shortcomings in their response to this tragedy. You also heard Commissioner Duheme fully commit to studying those recommendations.
I spoke with Minister Mendicino earlier today before the RCMP press conference. Minister, do you accept the overall findings that the RCMP failed here on all accounts before, during, and after this incident?
Well, David, first, thank you very much for having me. There's no doubt that this is a difficult day and a very difficult report to receive, but it pales in comparison to what the families of the victims have had to go through since what amounted to the worst shooting tragedy in this country's history. And that is why it was important that I was here, that the Prime Minister was here to receive the report, to go over the recommendations which touch on many of the challenges, or to use the words of Commissioner McDonald, the significant shortcomings in the police response to this. Our commitment is to make the changes that are necessary to protect our communities, and all of this work has to be grounded in the legacy of the victims, who we hope will take some small measure out of this as a step towards healing and closure. But there's still a lot of work to be done. We are committed to doing it on behalf of them and all Canadians.
Well, specifically on that, the Commission is calling for an external review and a restructuring of the RCMP. Will your government commit to following through on that?
Well, you're quite right that the Commission does make a number of important recommendations that touch on police procedures, on training, on leadership, on the relationship between police and government and the community itself. And we are going to take the time to absorb those recommendations, and our commitment is to make the changes that are necessary to mend the trust within the community, to keep our community safe so that this kind of thing never happens again.
A lot of these recommendations, though, for a review and a restructuring of the RCMP, they predate these awful, terrible events that happened in Nova Scotia. So, I mean, surely this is something the government must already have some thoughts on. I mean, does the RCMP need to be restructured? Does it need to get out of contract policing in places like rural Nova Scotia and focus more on being a truly national police force at the federal level?
There is no doubt that we need to continue to make reforms to the RCMP, as well as right across all of our institutions that are implicated in public safety. And earlier today, you heard the Commissioner of the RCMP, Mike Duheme, both accept the responsibility for this tragedy, but also commit to redoubling our efforts to make those reforms which are laid out in the mandate that I issued to the RCMP last year, that talk about enhancing many of the issues that are touched on by this report today. We need to use this report to accelerate that work, and that is precisely what we are committed to doing.
How much confidence should people have in the RCMP right now, sir, when you look at the litany of failures from April of 2020? I mean, they are profound, and they seem like basic things about communicating with the public in a time of great danger. I mean, the commission determined that at least 3 of the women killed were denied potentially life-saving information from the RCMP. They could have made different choices than they made that day. So should we believe that more people would be alive today? Do you believe that more people could be alive today had the RCMP responded better?
Look, I have no doubt that the first responders did their level best over those 13 hours here in Nova Scotia to try and save as many lives as possible. But despite those best efforts, there were definitely significant shortcomings, as the Commissioner pointed out earlier today. And you heard Commissioner Duheme accept that responsibility. You also heard from him a willingness and a commitment to mend that trust. And that is precisely what the government is there to do, to hold the RCMP to account, to make sure that we make those changes, do those reforms, so that Canadians can have trust in their institutions. And we are going to do that work together.
But when you read these findings, when you read those assertions, I mean, Heather O'Brien, a mother of 8, a Victorian Order of Nurses caretaker, who made the choice to go out and check on people because nobody told her that there was a man in an RCMP cruiser. Same with Kristen Beaton and the final victim, Gina Goulet. I mean, you can look at this and draw a conclusion that these 3 women might be alive had the RCMP acted differently. What conclusion do you draw?
Well, that is part of the painful reflection that we have to take away from this report, and having had the chance to grieve with a number of the families here in Nova Scotia, including individuals like Nick Beaton, who lost his wife, who was pregnant at the time. I can tell you that I am motivated, that our government is motivated to take away from this commission the recommendations to mend that trust, to make the changes that are necessary so that this kind of tragedy will never happen again. It is not easy work, and it is particularly difficult right now when families who were here and who were present to receive this report were no doubt re-traumatized, who were no doubt reliving some of those awful and agonizing and horrifying moments. But out of all of this, we have to take a commitment, a willingness to keep at this work so that we can mend that trust, so that we can make the changes, so that we can take away some of those specific recommendations and make the changes that are necessary.
You know, one of the conclusions is that it was apparent, according to the commissioners, that the organizational structure of the RCMP both contributed to these failings and makes it challenging to hold the organization accountable for its work. I mean, that's a pretty clear statement, it seems to me, Minister, that the RCMP as it exists today is not getting it done and it needs to be changed. Is that how you read that? Is that where you think this needs to go?
There is no doubt that there needs to be significant reforms and changes to the way in which we provide community policing through the RCMP. That is one of the key takeaways from this report today. And there are significant questions that were raised around protocols and training and the relationship between the police and the community and the way in which they notify and alert the community of significant risks to public safety. And we are going to take the time that is necessary to absorb these recommendations, work with other levels of government, work with law enforcement, do that through the lens of this commission report, but also through the mandate which we have issued to the RCMP so that we can reform it as an institution, make sure that Canadians can have trust in the RCMP, in law enforcement more broadly, so that we will never have to see this kind of tragedy occur again. And we owe it to the victims to make good on that commitment.
After you do the review, the commissioners have essentially given you a mandate, or at least the Office of the Minister of Public Safety, saying you should establish clear priorities for the RCMP, retaining the tasks that are suitable to a federal policing agency, and identifying what responsibilities are better assigned to other agencies. I mean, how far are you prepared to go on that? Do you need to ask Nova Scotia, for example, and other provinces that rely on contract policing to expand provincial police forces to focus on areas? Because a lack of local knowledge and local connection also played a role in the tragedies that unfolded in 2020.
Indeed, contract policing is one of the things that is in my mandate, and in turn, one of the priorities that I have articulated to the RCMP that we need to work on together with provinces and territories, and I did have an opportunity to exchange a few words with Premier Houston, with whom we are going to work very closely along with all of our other provincial and territorial partners when it comes to providing public safety right across the country. It is a very difficult day. It is a very difficult report, but we must out of it take the resolve that is necessary to study the recommendations, make the changes that are necessary. We owe it to the families of the victims who were here, and indeed all Canadians, to make good on that.
One of the other big changes that the Commission says is necessary, they make a series of recommendations concerning firearm prohibitions and firearm ownership. Some of this is already in the work with C-21. Some of it was attempted in the amendments that you've pulled back. Others are still being considered. Will your government move on all of these recommendations concerning firearms that were made in this report?
Well, the tragedy that occurred a little over 2.5 years ago here in Nova Scotia was the worst shooting in the history of the country. And that is precisely why we continue to be committed to doing everything within our power to address gun violence through smart policy, through investments in law enforcement, through the investments that we are making to stop the illegal flow of guns into our country at the border, but equally to address strategies that revolve around the social determinants which lead to violence and gun violence, which can cause the kind of tragedies and griefs that came out of Nova Scotia. And indeed, you heard Commissioner McDonald and the rest of the Commission talk about that today, about promoting community well-being and health. We need to take a comprehensive approach when it comes to reducing gun violence, and we will study the recommendations very carefully and see where we go from there.
Marco Mendicino, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Families of the victims of the mass shooting also spoke at today's event, expressing their hopes for change after the release of this report. Scott McLeod's brother, Sean McLeod, was killed in the shooting. I spoke with Scott earlier this afternoon. I want to thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'm sorry you have to do this interview, but I'm grateful you're taking the time. I know it's been a long wait to get to this point. I just wonder, sir, are you satisfied with the findings of this report?
I am. With the whole situation, it was never ever gonna, no one could ever tell you exactly everything, and you can't change what's happened. So with the recommendations coming out and having a body put in place to follow up on the recommendations, it's been a real positive setting to know that it's going to be followed up on, and that things are actually going to change. The implementation of this is going to hopefully make things a lot better across the country.
Well, what do you hope comes out of this? I mean, this has been an awful tragedy, but it's led to a pretty sober examination of policing, particularly in rural parts of Canada. I mean, what positives do you hope does come out of this, sir?
I hope to see a lot better communication. It's been a big thing. Within the departments, with assisting departments, the paramedics and other frontline officers and responders, as well as the public and victims of any kind of situation like this, be it the surviving victims or people that were traumatized or involved or impacted by this. Just so that there's a much clearer line of communication, like the Alert Ready system coming out, and I know they want to build upon what they have for the Alert Ready, which I think is great, and you know, it can help make a big difference because people are aware of stuff. They don't have to give all the details out, that they just need to make sure that people are aware so that they can maintain a safe place and be in a safe location.
The findings on this are pretty damning for the RCMP and how they conducted themselves, failing to see warning signs in the run-up to the shooting, failure to communicate and respond properly during the 2 days in question, and then sort of an insensitivity and in the wake of it in terms of dealing with people afterwards. What stood out to you when you saw all of this?
I'm hoping, like, I've heard a lot of people saying, I've seen it to a degree with within the RCMP, just coming across as being of a higher spot in the world than others. And hopefully this will bring things back in line, because regardless of who you are, you've got a specific job to do. And when that specific job is to work with the public and protect the public aren't looking for anything desperate. They just want to be informed of how things are being handled, and they don't want to be looked down upon, because it's not about that. It's, work with everybody. You're going to have better relations with the public, is going to lead to more people being willing to work with agencies. So, I mean, back to the old school policing models, where you talked to the public, you met your local people, you knew people. And, I mean, there's a limit to that, of course, but I mean, just be there for the people, not just, they got to realize that when they're responding to a situation, the people that they're responding to, a lot of times they're having one of the worst days of their life, and they don't need to feel like they're insignificant with dealing with the situation. So hopefully, bringing stuff in line is going to be a big thing out of all the recommendations that the Commission's put forth. And, it looks good, and hope that this is a major step forward to making things better for the RCMP, for the public, everybody in general. It's going to be hoped to see positive for it.
You spoke to the Prime Minister today, I understand it. What did you tell him about this? What do you want to see from Justin Trudeau and the federal government on following through on this?
Well, I managed to speak very, very briefly to Mr. Trudeau. I've been trying to reach out to him over the past, and I'm hoping, I requested a meeting of some sort, be it a Zoom meeting or anything, just to be able to discuss stuff and, have the public being able to reach out and find out where they stand with what's come out of this commission, and what they see as, how can they work with it, and find out the support that they're willing to give to us. Because if we don't have the support from our federal and provincial governments, then you're not going to get any kind of support, because aside from people being able to get the opportunity to speak with the media, that's the only voice we might get. And the media, for me, has been a huge voice, because they've been there with the victims and the families, and so, I mean, just to be able to get the opportunity to talk and try and find out where people stand that are in positions that can actually make things happen it's huge. And that's all I'm asking for, is a little bit of his time to see where we can go with this.
You seem remarkably calm, sir, for someone who lost his brother, and when you read the list of failures, it is something else. I mean, how do you stay so balanced with everything you've been through up to this point?
I wonder that most of the time myself. I've sit back and I've listened to a lot, and I work in one branch of federal law enforcement as well, and so, I mean, I see a lot of different things, and I mean, I'm fully aware of being able to deal with things in different ways. And for me, this has been a real learning curve, because I've never been a public speaker, or anybody at work would tell you I'm not the calm one, but I've tried. So I want to sit back and I want to look at this from different angles and ask the questions. And I mean, I want to be able to take the positive side of this, and losing my brother was a horrible thing to deal with, and I don't want to see it be in vain for anything. And if I can work with media, politicians, the police forces to try and build something positive, I think has been the real driving force behind my attitude towards things. And on top of that, I mean, I've got my family. For me to, break down and be miserable with myself and everybody around me, I mean, that's not good for my family. And I look at the fact that I got to be there for them as well. So I mean, it's been a challenge, but I've tried to stay on the positive side and hope that in the future we can fix problems so that something like this is not had to be dealt with again.
I read the obituary today for your brother Sean, and the picture there, he's holding up a couple of trout, I think they are. He was a correctional officer.
Yep.
He played rugby. He had a partner, Alana Jenkins, who was also killed in this. He had children and grandchildren. Aside from that summary information, what do you want people to know and remember about your brother?
Well, Sean was definitely a people person, very outgoing. His personal life, like he loved to have social get-togethers at his house. When it came to his work, working inside the institutions, he was fair right down the middle with everybody, whether it was staff or the inmates. He, whoever, someone had questions and needed help with something, he would work with you. And as a correctional officer, I mean, part of your job is to work with the inmates that you're dealing with to help them get ready to get out. But at the same time, I mean, you have to have that other side where when things are out of hand, you got to be able to control it. So, I mean, he liked his job. He was getting close to being able to retire from it. And when this happened, I figure had this not happened, he probably would have been able to retire any time now. And then he would have spent more time with family. He liked to bake and cook, and he also liked to do preserves in the fall and things like that. So I mean, very into the outdoors, the hunting and fishing. He just enjoyed life in general.
I know there's like 3,000 pages in this report and hundreds and dozens of recommendations, but just what is the one thing you would like to see to, I guess, honor the legacy of your brother? What is the one thing, the change that you would like to see that your effort in all of this and the patience you're showing is not in vain?
One of the big things that I have pushed and harped on to different people throughout this has been the alert ready and communication. I know the alert ready's been used in a lot more incidents now, but some of the recommendations in there are looking at making it a better system. I don't know if I can say robust, but definitely a better platform than what we have now.
Better than the tweet that went out, for example, as the warning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know people have said, well, they don't like the intrusive factor of it, but at the same time, that intrusive factor is what is going to potentially save people, keep them out of harm's way, regardless of what the situation is if people know that something's happening, you can avoid an area or you can stay secure in your home. And then that's a key thing in the communication. With the communication part of it, they need to be able to communicate better within the ranks and within other organizations that would partner with them in any situation. So, without that communication and the alert system, everything's going to fall apart to start with, because you can't control anything if you can't communicate.
Well, Scott McLeod, I'm sorry you had to do this interview, but I'm grateful for your generosity and your time. I'm so sorry for your loss, but thank you for speaking with us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.